Hey everybody, this is a piece from the book Ideas of Leon Trotsky, edited by Michael Cox and Hillel Ticktin. The piece is by Loren Goldner, and it originally appeared in Critique, like the rest of the articles in this book. It's titled Trotskyism and Trotsky, Pierre Broué as biographer. Wikipedia says Pierre Broué lived from 1926 to 2005 and was a French historian and Trotskyist revolutionary militant. His work covers the history of the Bolshevik Party, the Spanish Revolution, and biographies of Leon Trotsky. All right, so here we go. Pierre Broué, French historian, Trotskyist militant, and editor of Ideas of Leon Trotsky, published in 1988 an imposing biography of the, quote, organizer of victory, end quote, of the October Revolution. Footnote, this review first appeared in Critique number 25, 1993. As the Soviet state takes timid steps towards the tacit or full rehabilitation of Trotsky, the appearance of this book seems timely indeed. That rehabilitation will be meaningful only when Trotsky's writings become widely available to the Soviet public, and when the historical truth about Trotsky's role in the revolution and in the establishment of the young Soviet state, a role second only to Lenin's, can be freely discussed in open debate. When virtually every other, quote, old Bolshevik, end quote, murdered by Stalin has been rehabilitated under Gorbachev, the caution with which the partisans of glasnost proceed in the case of Trotsky is testimony to the explosiveness of the questions linked to Trotsky's name, questions with real implications for contemporary Soviet and world politics. Today, the prospect of a prompt Russian translation of books like Broué's and their diffusion in the current ferment in the Soviet Union is merely a heady one. Only a few years ago, it would have been surreal. One can think of few people more qualified than Broué to write this biography. For 45 years, Broué has been active in Trotskyist politics in France, where Trotskyism has arguably been of more real political importance than in any other country outside the Soviet Union itself. Broué has authored massive tomes on the Bolshevik Party, the German Revolution, and the Spanish Revolution, each in orthodox mold of the master. Broué has edited and prefaced an authoritative French edition of Trotsky's post-1928 writings. Broué has been at the center of much, quote, Trotsky research of recent decades, and Broué was at the door of Harvard's Houghton Library on the day in 1980 when Trotsky's archives were first opened to the public. Broué's biography of Trotsky is necessarily read in the shadow of Isaac Deutscher's even lengthier study, whose final volume appeared in 1963. In the post-war decades, the rise of a, quote, Sovietology, inspired by the Cold War, has made possible serious biographical studies of most of the revolutionaries of the Second and Third Internationals. To their credit, neither Deutscher nor Broué, as politically committed leftists, can be called, quote, Sovietologists, let alone Cold Warriors. Significantly absent from this scrutiny has been a biography of Lenin that even approaches what both Deutscher and Broué have done for Trotsky. Lenin's life blends all too completely into the history of Bolshevism and of the revolution itself. Some intangible quality in his personality, the supreme product of the century-long evolution of the Russian revolutionary milieu, has defeated every attempt to evoke the man behind the cascade of statistical studies of Russian agriculture, questionable epistemology, factional polemics, and Central Committee resolutions, which constitute the bulk of his writings. By partisan accounts, even some of Lenin's most historically significant speeches were delivered with the cool pedagogy of an accomplished schoolmaster. For many, Lenin's utter lack of the qualities conventionally associated with, quote, charisma, combined with Lenin's steeled pursuit of one lifelong goal, was precisely the source of an overwhelming charisma. But the, quote, wine, women, and song, end quote, in a life devoted to honing an apparatus and leading it to power, have thus far eluded a biographer worthy of the man. One even senses that Lenin, lacking any trace of personal vanity, would take pride in this. The problems confronting the biographer of Trotsky are of a rather different order. Trotsky lost. Trotsky is not first remembered by the average reader for Trotsky's unique application of the theory of permanent revolution to Russia, for Trotsky's almost unparalleled oratorical skills in the 1905 and 1917 revolutions, for his military organization of the seizure of the Winter Palace, or for building the Red Army. Indeed, for decades in both the Soviet Union and even in supposedly, quote, progressive circles in the West, it was flatly denied that Trotsky had done any of these things. Trotsky is remembered as the man who was defeated by Stalin. Lenin had his admirers and his enemies, but over what Lenin stood for and what he accomplished. But there is, let me read that. I think I fucked it up. Trotsky is remembered as the man who was defeated by Stalin. Lenin had admirers, Lenin had enemies, but there is, unfortunately, little controversy among Lenin's admirers and Lenin's enemies over what Lenin stood for and what Lenin accomplished. Quote, Leninism, a term invented after Lenin's death by Stalin, was part of the official ideology of 20 countries and countless political parties in the world today. Trotsky's name, on the other hand, has until very recently been associated with anathema in those same countries and in many of those parties. Where there is discussion of Trotsky, there is a problem of saving Trotsky from many, quote, Leninists, who are in fact merely Stalinists. There is, moreover, a problem, pace the 57 contemporary varieties of Trotskyism, end parenthesis, of establishing Trotsky's true historical stature, almost on par with Lenin, in order then to laugh, cry, or simply understand. It is therefore hardly surprising, yet is still noteworthy, that both of Trotsky's major biographers, Deutscher and Broué, have come out of the Trotskyist milieu. Deutscher's 3-volume study appeared from 1953 to 1963, at a time when such a biography was still, even in the West, very much an act of historical recovery. Deutscher had, in 1949, published a single volume on the life of Stalin. Prior to 1980, Deutscher was one of the very few individuals allowed to consult the closed section of Trotsky's archives at Harvard. For all its sweep and novelty in the atmosphere of ignorance and calumny still evoked by Trotsky in the West at the time, Deutscher's biography was also a political tract, an advocacy of, quote, Deutscherism, or a historical accommodation to Stalinism veiled in Trotskyist language. This accommodation was even more palpable in the early study of Stalin, a virtual paean to the Stalinist industrialization of the 1930s. Deutscherism, quote, Deutscherism amounted to a belief in the ability of the Stalinist bureaucracy to reform itself, a belief confirmed for Deutscher in the emergence of Khrushchev and presumably dashed in the emergence of Brezhnev. But the best heirs of Trotsky retained the old man's perspective that only a new working class revolution could put an end to Stalinism. One second. Okay, sorry about that. What did I last say? But the best heirs of Trotsky retained the old man's perspective that only a new working class revolution could put an end to Stalinism. Broué's book is no less a work of political advocacy, and one senses that Broué wants to polemicize with Deutscher on every page. Broué admits as much in the preface. One can readily agree that Broué is more restrained, certainly more the historian, and more correctly, quote, Trotskyist than Deutscher, but one would also think that 25 years later, after uncovering new archival material, and most importantly, after so much world history and so many polemics in which the relevance of Trotsky's ideas has been debated almost as intensely as 50 years ago, Broué would have written a biography showing the marks of these developments. The reader approaching this book with such hopes, however, will be disappointed. Like his earlier orthodox books on the Bolshevik Party, Spain, and Germany, this is as close to an official Trotskyist work on Trotsky as we are ever likely to see, and there is ultimately something dry about Broué's Trotsky. One major problem for Trotskyism and for Deutscher is that almost all the leading figures of the left opposition in the Soviet Union capitulated to Stalin after 1928. Many of them did so because they saw Stalin implementing the left's, quote, super-industrialization, end quote, program on his own. All their self-abasement and toadying did not stop Stalin from shooting every one of them over the next decade. But Trotsky, to his great credit, realized that there was a political dimension to Stalin's, quote, borrowing of the left's economic program, and did not capitulate. Since his death, a fondness of Stalinist, quote, productivism, end quote, has led many Trotskyists to blunt his political critique and to become the noisy, quote, left wing, end quote, of the Stalinists, an affection that has generally been little reciprocated. This is not Broué's problem. Broué shows repeatedly where Deutscher's chiding of Trotsky concealed a covert, or not so covert, a political agreement with Trotsky's adversaries, or at the very least a misunderstanding of Trotsky's views. But if we admit that Broué's book is more, quote, truly Trotskyist, unquote, more truly the work of an historian, it must also be said that the quote, literary, end quote, merits of Deutscher are superior to those of Broué. The panorama of an epoch moves in and out of Deutscher's trilogy, in which the arena of Trotsky's life is not merely the historical stage of the socialist movement in Europe and North America, but the whole zeitgeist associated with Nietzsche, Ibsen, Freud, and the post-1917 Russian avant-garde, or finally the avant-garde figures such as André Breton and Diego Rivera, who rallied to Trotsky during his exile in the 1930s. With Deutscher, one is present as Trotsky breathlessly awakens Lenin and Krupskaya in a London dawn in 1902 to introduce himself upon escape from Siberian exile, or when in 1907 Trotsky escapes a second time across the tundra of the Ostyaks. One is present during his émigré life in Vienna before 1914, or when, after his internment in Canada in 1917, Trotsky is carried to the camp gates on the shoulders of the German POWs whom his speeches, in German, won over to revolution. All this evocation of a real life, in its quotidian as in its world historical dimension, does not excuse Deutscher's attempt to enlist Trotsky in his own variant of Trotskyism, but it gives Deutscher's book a human quality far more intense than Broué's, more documented, prosaic, and more, quote, correct, end quote, account. Perhaps the most striking example of Broué's shortcomings is his portrait of the most critical years of Trotsky's life, when from 1923 to 1927 he was losing his battle with Stalin. In some sense, what is unique to, quote, Trotskyism, as opposed to, quote, Leninism, is the legacy of Trotsky in this period, after Lenin's death in 1924. Trotsky and Trotskyism's claim to constitute the real continuity of Bolshevism against Stalin began in the fight against Stalin's doctrine of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, the struggle against the Bukharinist right and the Stalinist, quote, center, in the industrialization debate, in the battle over the Comintern's suicidal bungling of the Chinese Revolution in 1927. One of the most perplexing questions hanging over Trotsky's life is Trotsky's failure, on several occasions, to fight Stalin inside the party when the fight between them was still undecided. Trotsky allowed Lenin's testament, calling for Stalin's removal from the position of General Secretary, to be suppressed by a decision of the party. Trotsky repudiated his American follower, Max Eastman, when Max Eastman published The Testament in the New York Times in 1926. On several occasions when Stalin was still vulnerable, Trotsky sat silently in party proceedings to the consternation of his supporters. When the left opposition was completely defeated and Trotsky was formally expelled from the Bolshevik Party, a friend and colleague, Adolf Joffe, shot himself in protest in his Kremlin office. And Adolf Joffe lived from 1883 to 1927. Adolf Joffe was a Russian revolutionary, a Bolshevik politician, and a Soviet diplomat of Karaite descent. Back to the text. Joffe addressed his suicide letter to Trotsky, in which Joffe wrote, quote, "I have always thought that you have not had enough in yourself of Lenin's unbending and unyielding character, not enough of that ability which Lenin had to stand alone and remain alone on the road which Lenin considered to be the right road, ... You have often renounced your own correct attitude for the sake of an agreement or a compromise, the value of which you have overrated," end quote. Adolf Joffe. No one had ever talked to Trotsky in that fashion. It goes to the heart of a, quote, psychological, end quote, dimension of Trotsky's inability to carry on the struggle against Stalin without Lenin. This is not to suggest a psychological explanation for his defeat, but merely a psychological aspect of Trotsky's defeat. Yet it is such a dimension which Broué, writing a purely, quote, political and, quote, historical book, is at great pains to avoid. Broué thinks that by showing, against Deutscher, the superior Marxist logic in Trotsky's reasons for shying away from several lost opportunities, he has obviated the need for any, quote, psychology, and gives further lofty Marxist reasons why such a discussion is not necessary. But, while quoting abundantly from Joffe's Testament, Broué manages to omit the first half of the above passage. For Broué, as for most orthodox Trotskyists, revolutionary politics are exclusively a question of, quote, correct positions, end quote, as he is at great pains to show against Deutscher. Yet by eschewing any discussion of Trotsky's failure of nerve on several occasions, in the 1923 to 27 period, he appears less honest than Deutscher's politically motivated but partially, quote, psychological portrait. Habent sua fata libelli. Books have their fates. And Wikipedia says the Latin expression "po captu lectores habent sua fata libelli," literally, according to the capabilities of the readers, books have their destiny, is verse 1286 of De Letteris de Syllabis de Metris by Terentianus Maurus. Libelli is the plural of the Latin word libellus, which is a diminutive of liber, book, suggesting the qualification little books was actually meant, but in fact libellus was used to mean tracts, pamphlets, etc. Back to the text. Habant sua fata libelli. Books have their fates. Deutscher's book, for all Deutscher's book's problems, had the good fortune to appear on the upswing of the post-1956 thaw in the world communist movement, when thousands of militants of the 1960s looked around for alternatives to social democracy and Stalinism. Deutscher's book was one place to start. In France and Britain, for decades after 1968, Trotskyist groups were the most visible organized expression of the left of the French Communist Party and the Labour Party even if it is patently false to characterize them as the most authentic heirs of the ferment of the 1960s. In Japan, they were even more dominant. Today, Broué's book appears in a context of unprecedented mass ferment in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union itself, and it may in the long run be as influential as Deutscher's. But in the West, since the mid-1970s, the important Trotskyist groups have largely shriveled up, along with most other carryovers from the New Left, and much of the current vocal opposition in the East is unfortunately clamoring not so much for Trotsky and Soviets as for Milton Friedman and more consumer goods. More importantly, the prestige of the Russian Revolution and the Russian Revolution's heirs has been drastically deflated as a model or point of reference, and not merely in the West. Still more importantly, from the 1960s onwards, an international discussion has taken place in which the whole concept of Bolshevik vanguardism, and therefore of Trotskyism, has been radically questioned from various points of view. Some of them to the, quote, left of Trotskyism. None of this had happened when Deutscher wrote. But now, Broué's book reads like the words of a man from another era. Broué writes as if the, quote, poetry that the early phase of the Russian Revolution could yet evoke for many in the 1960s were still in the air. Of course, Broué is writing a biography and is not obliged to make his work, quote, relevant to the polemics of the present. But Broué truly writes as if the history of the past 25 years, and therefore the way in which we think about the more distant past, had never occurred. Broué is certainly to be commended for not bending to the waves of cretinization which have swept through the French intelligentsia since the appearance of the, quote, new philosophers in 1977, but it seems slightly breathtaking to write, in the midst of a deeper crisis of Marxism, of which the, quote, new philosophers were only the vulgar pamphleteers, without the slightest sense that something has gone wrong, and without attempting to join these developments polemically. Broué is a militant, and Broué has written a militant book for a new generation awakening to politics. But Broué does not seem to have noticed that in the past 15 years, much of the world appears to have exited the political universe defined by the Russian Revolution. That, quote, historical turning point where history did not turn, end quote, as someone once put it. Even the head of the Soviet state has recently expressed a desire to leave that universe. This may, of course, turn out to be an illusion, and some future turn of the historical spiral may again find the international left debating the, quote, Russian enigma, the, quote, philosopher's stone of 20th century history as intensely as it did 15 or 20 years ago. But I doubt it. Everything that underwrote the centrality of the, quote, Russian question, end quote, in the international left as late as the 1970s rested on the view of Russia as a generalizable model of the future, a future of a society without classes, for some, a future of a new form of class domination, for others, a still valid model of a future proletarian revolution, for still others. Even as they awaited the new working class revolution to restore the power of the Soviets and rid the Soviet Union of bureaucracy, the Trotskyists saw the, quote, gains of the October Revolution, end quote, preserved in the system of central planning and state property that assured a steady, if unspectacular, rate of economic growth. 1 second. But today, with an internal expansion of the market and an entry into the international division of labor, even that mirage has evaporated for the Eastern Bloc. Again, Trotsky was assassinated in 1940, and Trotsky's biographer is not obliged to deal explicitly with any of these questions. But to the extent that all history is, to some extent, inevitably, quote, present, end quote, history, one might think that Broué would approach Trotsky with the questions of the present. To the extent that Broué does not, the reader can only look elsewhere for enlightenment on the ever-fascinating, quote, Russian enigma, end quote. That's the end of the review. Thank you so much for listening.